Sometimes a man makes a promise that changes everything. One word given under the scorching Arizona sun can be worth more than all the gold buried in the desert. Thomas Mitchell was riding along the dusty trail when he saw the boy. The hot wind whipped the dry land, raising swirls of sand that danced among the cacti. His chestnut mare treaded carefully among the loose stones, and the leather of the saddle creaked in the monotonous rhythm of the walk. Thomas knew that region as few men did. He had spent the last 15 years traversing every canyon, every dry stream, every rock formation of those badlands. The boy was sitting in the scanty shade of a sage bush, too small to offer real protection from the relentless sun. His tanned leather clothes were worn and soiled with red dust, the dark eyes fixed on Thomas with a mixture of fear and despair that made the cowboy instinctively pull the reins. The child could not have been more than 10 years old, but he already carried on his face that expression of someone who knew hunger and thirst up close. Thomas got off his horse slowly, keeping his hands visible. He knew that sudden movements could frighten the child and make him run into the desert, where he would surely die before sunset. The heat radiated from the ground in visible waves, distorting the air and creating mirages that played with tired eyes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of insects and the harsh sound of the wind between the rocks. The boy tried to get up as Thomas approached, but his legs failed and he plummeted back to the ground. Her half-open mouth revealed lips cracked by thirst. Thomas took the canteen out of his belt and knelt beside the child. Without saying a word, she tilted the container and let a few drops of water touch the boy's parched lips. The boy drank desperately, but Thomas controlled the flow, knowing that too much water at once could do more harm than good. While the child drank, Thomas surveyed his surroundings with expert eyes. There were no signs of recent encampment, no tracks of horses or people passing through the region. The boy had been alone for days, maybe weeks. His clothes and adornments indicated that he belonged to one of the tribes that still roamed those lands, but Thomas could not identify which one. Tensions between settlers and natives had intensified in recent months, and many tribes had been forced to abandon their traditional territories. The cowboy opened his travel bag and pulled out a piece of jerky. He broke it into small pieces and offered it to the boy, who chewed it slowly as if each fiber were a precious treasure. Thomas watched the process patiently, recognizing in the child's gestures the discipline of someone who learned to value every crumb. It was a lesson Thomas himself had learned during his early years in the territory, when survival depended on making what little he had last. When the boy finished eating, his eyes met Thomas's. There were no words between them, but something happened at that moment. A silent understanding that transcended language and cultural barriers. The boy pointed to himself and said something in his native language, but Thomas just shook his head, indicating that he didn't understand. Then the boy touched his own chest and said a word that sounded like Ayana. Thomas nodded and repeated the name, making the boy smile faintly. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, tinting the sky red and orange. Thomas knew he needed to make a decision quickly. Leaving the boy there meant condemning him to certain death, but taking him with her could create complications he wasn't prepared to face. The region was seething with tensions, and a white cowboy carrying a native child could be viewed with suspicion by both sides of the conflict. Ayana tried to get up again, this time managing to stand for a few seconds before staggering. Thomas held him by the shoulders and felt how light, almost frail, the child's body was. Malnutrition had taken its toll, and it would take great care to return him to full health. The cowboy made his decision at that moment, driven by an impulse that came from somewhere deep in his chest, a place he rarely let speak. He carried the boy to his mare and helped him into the saddle. Ayana clung to the animal's mane with trembling hands, but her eyes showed a spark of hope that hadn't been there a few minutes earlier. Thomas mounted behind him and adjusted the reins. He knew of a small stream a few miles away, a sheltered place where they could spend the night and where the running water would allow for proper cleaning for both him and the boy. During the ride, Thomas felt the weight of the responsibility he had assumed. It wasn't just a matter of feeding and protecting the boy until his tribe was found. It was something bigger, an unspoken promise he had made to himself when he decided not to let that boy die alone in the desert. The wind carried the smell of a distant storm, and Thomas hoped it was a good omen. Rain would mean fresh water and perhaps a temporary reprieve from the sweltering heat that had gripped the land for weeks. The small camp by the stream offered a temporary refuge from the hostile wilderness. Running water murmured between the smooth stones, a sound Thomas had learned to treasure after years of roaming dry lands. Ayana sat on the bank, dipping her bare feet in the cool stream as she watched Thomas prepare a small fire. The cowboy chose dry branches carefully, knowing that too much smoke could attract unwanted attention. The first night had been difficult. The boy had woken up several times, shaking and mumbling words in his native language. Thomas remained awake, stoking the fire and keeping watch for the pair. When the sun rose, painting the rocks golden, Ayana looked a little stronger. He had drunk enough water to rehydrate his small body, and the jerky had given him the energy he needed to stay on his feet for longer periods. Thomas watched the boy as he carefully explored the area around the creek. Ayana moved with a natural grace that impressed the cowboy. Even weakened by hunger, the boy demonstrated instinctive knowledge about desert plants and animals. He pointed to some herbs that grew among the rocks and made gestures indicating that they were edible. Thomas nodded, acknowledging the wisdom passed down from generation to generation among native peoples. The second day brought unexpected challenges. Nights appeared on the horizon around noon, their silhouettes distorted by the heat radiating from the ground. Thomas counted 5 men, and from the way they rode, they were not peaceful merchants or farmers. Ayana sensed the tension in the air and instinctively hid behind a rock formation. The boy had developed keen survival instincts during his weeks alone in the desert. The nights passed by without noticing the small camp, but Thomas knew it was only a matter of time before someone started asking questions. A lone cowboy was common in those lands, but a white man caring for a native child would arouse suspicion on both sides. There were stories of settlers kidnapping native children, as well as reports of tribes attacking isolated farms. The truth was that mistrust and fear gripped the region like an invisible storm. Thomas made a decision that would weigh on his conscience for the next few days. He needed to find information about the Ayana tribe, but that meant leaving the boy alone for a few hours. He explained by gestures that he needed to go to the nearest town, a small town called Cedar Ridge that was a 2-hour ride away. Ayana understood and nodded, showing impressive maturity for her age. The cowboy left his extra food and water with the boy, as well as teaching him some basic danger signs. If anyone approached, Ayana was to hide in the rocks and wait for Thomas to return. The boy showed perfect understanding of the instructions, and Thomas set off with a heavy heart, looking back several times before disappearing into the barren hills. Cedar Ridge was little more than a dusty street lined with sun-worn wooden buildings. Thomas tied his mare in front of the hall and entered slowly. The interior was dark and cool, a welcome relief after riding under the scorching sun. Some men played cards at a table in the corner, and the bartender wiped glasses with a dirty cloth. The atmosphere became tense as Thomas approached the counter. The questions Thomas asked were careful and indirect. He mentioned having seen indigenous tracks in the region and asked if anyone knew of tribes passing through the area recently. The answers were vague and loaded with suspicion. One grey-bearded man mentioned that soldiers had relocated some native families to a reservation to the north, but he did not know specific details. Another commented on attacks on isolated farms, but their stories sounded more like rumors than facts. Thomas bought basic supplies and some clothes that could suit Ayana. She knew that the boy's traditional clothes would make him very visible, and this could be dangerous for both of them. As he paid for his groceries, the bartender leaned over the counter and whispered a warning. There were militiamen in the region looking for fugitive Indians, and anyone found outside the reservation would be captured and returned to the authorities. The words chilled Thomas's blood. The ride back to camp seemed endless. Thomas forced his mare into a steady gallop, ignoring the heat and dust that clung to her sweaty skin. When he finally spotted the familiar rocks near the creek, his heart raced as he saw no immediate signs of Ayana. He quickly dismounted and called the boy's name in a low voice, fearing the worst. Ayana emerged from her hiding place among the rocks, smiling as she saw Thomas return. The relief the cowboy felt was so intense that his legs trembled momentarily. The boy had followed his instructions to the letter, remaining hidden and alert throughout Thomas's absence. He had even collected some berries that grew near the stream, demonstrating his ability to take care of himself, even in difficult circumstances. That night, as he watched Ayana sleep next to the crackling fire, Thomas faced the reality of his situation. The information he had gathered at Cedar Ridge painted a grim picture. The region was becoming increasingly dangerous for natives, and keeping Ayana safe would be more challenging than she had initially imagined. But looking at the sleeping boy's serene face, Thomas quietly renewed his promise. He would find the boy's family, no matter how long it took or what risks he had to face. The following days brought a routine that Thomas had never imagined living. He woke up before dawn to check his surroundings, ensuring that no danger approached during the night. Ayana was always awake when Thomas returned from these rounds, sitting by the warm ashes of the campfire, watching the horizon with watchful eyes. The boy had developed his own surveillance system, using sounds and movements that Thomas was learning to interpret. Communication between them evolved daily. Ayana pointed to objects and pronounced words in her native language, while Thomas repeated and taught the English equivalents. Water became water and then returned to the melodious sound that Ayana used. Food, fire, horse, danger. Every word created a bridge between two worlds that rarely found each other at peace. Thomas found that the boy possessed an impressive memory, remembering every word he taught and using them in the correct context. On the 5th day, the water in the stream began to recede. The small stream that had been his lifeline was drying up quickly, leaving only shallow puddles between the rocks. Thomas knew they needed to move, but the decision of where to go weighed on him like a stone in his chest. Ayana seemed to understand the situation and gestured north, repeating a word that Thomas couldn't decipher, but that carried urgency in his tone. The journey north revealed a different Thomas from the lone cowboy who had met Ayana days earlier. He found himself talking to the boy, even though he knew that many words were not understood. He told stories about his mare, about the sandstorms he had faced, about the stars he used to orient himself during night trips. Ayana listened attentively, occasionally smiling or asking questions through expressive gestures. Thomas realized that he was becoming more careful, more attentive to details that he had previously ignored. The boy's presence had awakened in him a protective instinct that he did not know he possessed. He constantly checked that Ayana was comfortable in the saddle, that she had enough water, that the new clothes she had bought were not hurting her still sensitive skin. It was as if a part of Thomas, asleep for years, had awakened to take care of this child. In the 2nd week of living together, they met another traveler, a Mexican merchant named Eduardo, who transported fabrics and spices in a cart pulled by 2 stubborn mules. Eduardo spoke to Thomas in English mixed with Spanish, but when he saw Ayana, his eyes lit up with recognition. The merchant addressed the boy a few words in a language Thomas didn't recognize, and Ayana responded excitedly for the first time since they met. Eduardo explained that he had known the region for decades and had traded with various tribes over the years. He recognized the adornments Ayana still wore as belonging to the Tohono O'odham people, who traditionally inhabited territories in what was now southern Arizona. The trader said that a portion of the tribe had been relocated to a federal reservation about 100 miles to the north, but other families had dispersed across the desert, trying to maintain their traditional ways of life. The information was both hopeful and discouraging. Thomas finally had a clue as to where to look for Ayana's family, but the distance and dangers of the path were intimidating. Eduardo offered to take them part of the way, but warned about the military patrolmen who policed the region. Any native found outside the reservation would automatically be captured and brought to the authorities, regardless of their history or circumstances. That night, camped by Edward's wagon, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of his life. Not only would he accompany Ayana to find her family, he would make sure the boy got there safely, even if it meant defying the local authorities. It was a dangerous choice that could result in imprisonment or worse, but Thomas had made a silent promise that he intended to keep. Edward left the next morning, leaving them with extra provisions and a rudimentary map of the northern region. Before leaving, the merchant pulled Thomas aside and whispered a warning. He had heard rumors about a militia of farmers who hunted natives on their own, claiming to protect their properties. These men followed no law other than their own will, and were known for their cruelty. If Thomas and Ayana were captured by them, no official authority would protect them. The cowboy kept the warning in his heart as he watched Eduardo's wagon disappear into the distance. Ayana was at his side, holding the mare's reins with small hands that had gained calluses in recent weeks. The boy had visibly grown during their time together, not only in physical strength, but in confidence and determination. His eyes no longer carried the desperate despair that Thomas had seen that first day. As they prepared to continue their journey north, Thomas looked at Ayana and saw something that surprised him. The boy was smiling, a small but genuine smile that lit up his brown face. It was as if he knew that they were nearing the end of their ordeal, that they would soon be reunited with their family. Thomas returned the smile and mounted his mare, pulling Ayana to the saddle in front of him. The road ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but Thomas Mitchell had found something he didn't know he was looking for. In the last 2 weeks, taking care of that native boy, he had discovered a purpose that went beyond simple survival in the arid desert. He had found a reason to fight, to take risks, to be better than the lonely man he had been for so long. And as he spurred his mare north, Thomas knew there was no turning back. He would take Ayana home, no matter the cost. The journey north tested every fiber of courage Thomas possessed. For 5 days, they rode through increasingly hostile terrain, avoiding main roads and sticking to the abandoned trails that wind between canyons and rock formations. Ayana proved to be a natural guide, pointing out hidden water sources and paths that offered better coverage. The boy had become his partner in that dangerous mission, not just a burden to be protected. On the 6th day, they spotted smoke on the horizon. Thomas initially feared it was a military camp, but Ayana became visibly excited, pointing in the direction of the smoke and repeating words in her native language with increasing excitement. The cowboy understood that the boy recognized something familiar in those distant signs. They approached cautiously, using the shadows of the rocks to mask their presence as they watched the valley below. What Thomas saw left him speechless. Hidden in a protected valley was a small camp of traditional tents and makeshift shelters. About 20 people moved between the structures, and even from a distance, Thomas could see that they were natives living as simply as possible. Ayana began to tremble with excitement next to him, and tears began to stream down her dusty face. The moment of rapprochement was tense. Thomas knew that her presence could be interpreted as a threat, so he decided to let Ayana get off the mare and get closer first. The boy ran down the hill, shouting words that echoed through the valley. The reaction in the camp was immediate. People ran towards the voice, and Thomas saw a woman emerge from one of the tents and collapse to her knees when she recognized the boy. The meeting was an explosion of emotions that Thomas observed from afar, respecting the intimacy of the moment. Ayana was enveloped by hugs from people who clearly loved him and who had grieved his absence. An older woman, probably his grandmother, held the boy's face in her hands, examining him as if to confirm that he was indeed there, alive and relatively well. Thomas remained on the hill for almost an hour before Ayana rushed up to pick him up. The boy took his hand and pulled him toward the camp, gesturing excitedly and clearly explaining to his family who the man who had saved him was. The reception Thomas received was cautious but respectful. The adults of the tribe examined him with careful eyes, but their expressions were of gratitude, not hostility. Communication was difficult but not impossible. A young woman who spoke basic English served as a translator, explaining to Thomas how Ayana had gotten lost during a sandstorm 3 weeks earlier. The family had searched for him for days before being forced to continue their journey to avoid military patrols. They had established this temporary camp in the hope that the boy would find his way to them, but they feared the worst with each passing day. Thomas stayed at the camp for 2 days, watching Ayana reintegrate into her family. The boy was visibly happy, playing with other children and helping with daily chores with an energy Thomas hadn't seen before. But there was something in the boy's eyes as he looked at Thomas, a deep gratitude mixed with something that looked like sadness for the approaching separation. On the morning of the 3rd day, Thomas prepared to leave. He knew that their prolonged presence might attract unwanted attention to the tribe, and they were already at enough risk just by existing outside the official reservation. Ayana approached him as she saddled her mare, carrying something in her small hands. It was a necklace made of beads and polished stones, clearly an object of sentimental value. The boy put the necklace around Thomas's neck and said a few words that the translator explained meant "brother of the heart." It was a title of honor that was rarely given to anyone outside the tribe, especially a white man. Thomas felt a lump in his throat when he understood the meaning of that gesture. He had earned not only the gratitude of that family, but a permanent place in their traditions and memories. The farewell was brief but intense. Thomas hugged Ayana one last time, feeling how the boy had grown and strengthened during their weeks together. There was something different about that hug. It was both a thank you and a promise. Thomas mounted his mare and waved to the gathered family, etching in his memory the image of Ayana surrounded by those who loved him. As he rode away from the valley, Thomas carried more than just the satisfaction of a promise fulfilled. The weeks of caring for Ayana had changed something fundamental in her character. He had discovered that he was capable of fatherly love, of selfless sacrifice, of courage that went beyond mere survival. The native boy had taught him lessons about family and loyalty that no school or church could impart. Weeks later, when Thomas arrived in the city of Tucson to replenish his supplies, he heard rumors about a tribe that had managed to strike an agreement with local officials to remain on their traditional lands. The agreement had been brokered by an influential farmer who assured them that the tribe posed no threat and could even contribute knowledge about desert agriculture. Thomas smiled as he heard the story, suspecting that Ayana and her family had found a way to thrive despite all the odds. The necklace that Ayana had given him never left Thomas's neck. It became his constant reminder that some promises are worth more than gold, and that a man can find out who he really is when he chooses to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Thomas Mitchell had set out on that journey as a lone cowboy, but he returned as someone who had proven to himself that he was capable of being much more than he realized. Years later, when he told the story to other travelers in dusty taverns, Thomas always ended with the same words. Sometimes a man finds his purpose in the most unexpected places, and the greatest riches in the world are those that cannot be counted in gold coins. The promise he had made to a hungry boy in the desert had become the foundation of a new life, built on values he didn't even know he possessed. If this story of courage and survival has touched your heart, You can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West. Subscribe to the channel to follow more accounts about men and women who braved the arid desert with only their determination and code of honor.